Hello again, YouTube. It's Skylar. Welcome back to my face. Now, before we begin today's episode, I would like to point out that I did make a GoFundMe to help raise funds for my breast augmentation, and I'm putting a link down in the description. So, if you're interested in helping me with that, great. And if not, that's fine too. So, today I want to talk about transphobia, and specifically, why are people so transphobic? It's so different from any other kind of prejudice that I've observed. Not that I've experienced all forms of prejudice in my life, but being a trans woman, I have experienced a fair deal amount of transphobia towards myself and people that are like me. And I just wanted to elaborate a little more on why this might be. Why are people so afraid of trans people? So, believe it or not, and it may be surprising to a lot of people who are not within the LGBT community, but there's also, within general society, a lot of transphobia within the LGBT community itself, which you may be a little shocked to hear that, like, wait, I thought like you're all on the same team. But no, that's how deep transphobia goes, is that even people that identify as gay, lesbian, and bisexual, there's a lot of transphobia in those communities themselves, and it's really hard to pinpoint exactly where that's coming from. So the only thing that I can think of is that it's literally a social conditioning on a mass scale, where people are raised and brought up believing that trans people are basically evil, or they're the boogeyman in the closet, or I think it comes down to the fact that there's not that many trans people, so people's experience with encountering trans people is extremely limited. So people can only make conjecture about who trans people are from third party, unless of course they interact with them themselves, in which case I would hope that they would be reasonable enough to see and understand that they're just like anyone else and they deserve to be treated with respect. So, but I think those are the two identifying factors as to why transphobia is so widespread and so deep in extent. It's really, really hard to describe to someone that hasn't experienced transphobia, but imagine throughout your daily life so many instances of just very minute, very acute microaggressions. Or the reason that I say this is because I can tell the difference from before I transitioned and afterwards. And I can always tell when someone is being transphobic towards me, because subconsciously, I don't even think they're aware of it, but they're giving subtle clues and body language and expression and demeanor that suggests that they feel uncomfortable. And I say subconscious because even though they verbally say things that are socially appropriate, the body language, which is mostly subconscious, is deferred and reserved and disposed to not wanting to be around this person. And obviously there's different levels from instances such as that to actual verbal or physical abuse and everything in between. But it's important to recognize what's causing that fear, because it's, I think, caused by a lot of misunderstanding around trans people, which comes back to community awareness. And because humans are social creatures, we like to think in group mentality. That's not to say that we're not independent thinkers, or we're all herds that follow the crowd. No. But when you are raised in an environment, no matter where it is, where 80 to 90% of people believe one thing, and in this case, it's trans people are not okay. You know, you can make that interpretation of however you want to elaborate on what that means, but let's just go with the assumption for simplification that 80 to 90% of people are brought up or raised by their parents, grandparents, and family members in their community being taught that trans people are not acceptable in society. And because most of them all agree with each other, they all grow up having that same mentality. And this is what contributes to a lot of transphobia, is because everyone thinks that trans people are one way, regardless of whether their facts are legitimately true or not. And this causes them to create misconceptions and biases and stereotypes about this group of people. So it's really hard to undo that, but again, and I've said this probably 1,000 times now, education is the most important thing. Education, education, education. I know, broken record, but it's true. The more that we can educate people that transgender people are a normal part of society and they're just like anyone else, they have their own challenges that are different, that people need to come to terms with that so that they can accept that there are people in this world that are different than them, and that's okay. But this underlying fear of what they most likely perceive, more often than not, is probably not true and not based in reality. So it's just difficult. It's difficult for me. It's difficult to see those in my community and those around the country who say and do things that are contradicting the verbal assertion that they are for transgender rights, that they are for transgender civil liberties, and then proceed to think and act differently than that. So it's very ingrained in people's psyche, and prejudice isn't, you're not born prejudiced towards people. It's learned. You learned to be prejudiced towards this group of people, and it takes a long time for you to undo all of that negative thinking about that group. And this is probably why there's so many discrimination around the world with vast numbers of minorities. But it just goes to show how deep the rot goes in society with, you know, just misinformation, because it's been for the longest time a cultural understanding that trans people are not allowed to exist in society, or some variation of that idea. And so once a person does finally have the opportunity to finally interact with a trans person at some point in their life, they already have all of this baggage and information and prejudice and bias of, you know, countless jokes and harassment and thoughts of who these people are. And then they just project and unload all of that all at once on this person who they just met and have no understanding of who that person is. And that's where that comes from. So I do think that transgender visibility in the media has helped a lot, but at the same time, there's still a long way to go as far as education and understanding. It starts with the educational system. It starts with cultural understanding, and making sure that people at least have the opportunity to learn about trans people in a way that's not negative, so that when they do interact, because we do all live in the same society, we have to interact with one another, there's not this repressed fear or tension of, you know, just underlying discrimination. And I think once we can affect that and we can correct that, it'll also bleed into other areas of discrimination where people start to realize, maybe for the first time, hey, maybe I shouldn't act mean towards someone I just met because of some preconceived notion of who that person might be. It's hard, especially because there's still a lot of stereotypes around trans people, and I'm not going to go into the details of stereotypes because I think stereotypes are extremely ugly and disgusting and, paint people in a broad sense that's not true. But like for myself, I'm sure there's lots of people that have preconceived notions of trans people, but, if you just asked me like who I am, aside from the fact that I'm a trans woman, I would just say I like video games, I have a job, I pay taxes, and I like heavy metal. I have a car, I go out on the weekends and have fun, I like to eat at restaurants. And once people start to become aware and they go, oh, well, these people are pretty much just like me. And they're not really that different as much as I thought they were. But that's the point. That's what we've been trying to tell you this whole time. We aren't any different. We just happen to be a different gender. That's it. That's the only distinctual difference. Everything that comes along with those stereotypes, society made up. Society made up and then pushed that onto a minority in a minority that's so small that it has very hard time defending itself against, criticism and legal action from the majority of society. So, sorry, going over my time already. But, yeah, so it starts with that, and, it all comes back to the educational system, which right now in this country is totally abysmal in almost every area. So, there's a lot of work to be done, not just for trans people, not just for all minorities, but, for all Americans, to have a good education and not be short-sighted by society's misconceptions of certain groups of people. So, with that said, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!